The mist in the high hollows was a living thing. It coiled through the gnarled rhododendron and clung to the bark of the ancient hemlocks, a cold, grey shroud that swallowed sound and distance. For the people of Hollow Creek, the mist was a neighbor, a protector. They were the Melungeons, a people whose origins were a whispered puzzle, a tapestry woven with threads of Portuguese shipwrecks, lost Turkish traders, and the old, indigenous blood of the mountains themselves. Their skin was the color of weathered oak, their eyes held the deep, still light of a forest pool, and they kept to their own ways. They were a quiet people, but the mountains had taught them a silence that was not peace, but a patient, waiting knowledge. The trouble began not with a shout, but with the absence of one. Old man Malachi, who knew the paths of the black bear and the language of the creek stones, went out to check his traps and did not return. The silence he left behind was different. It was a sharp, hungry silence. Then the riders came, 6 men from the valley settlement of Stonebrook, their faces hard and flat as river stones. They were led by Silas Thorne, a man whose smile was a weapon and whose eyes held no light at all. They wanted timber rights, they said. They wanted land. They spoke of progress and law, but their gazes lingered on the Melungeon women and their hands rested on the butts of their rifles. The community's elder, a woman named Ilara with hair like spun silver and eyes that saw too much, refused them with a quiet finality. The next night, the smoke rose, thick and black, carrying the scent of pine sap and burning home. Malachi's cabin. When the men of Hollow Creek reached the clearing, they found only smoldering ruins and, pinned to a blistered chestnut tree with a skinning knife, the old man's rabbit fur cap. Worse was to come. 3 girls, gathering ramps by the creek, were gone. Not lost. Taken. A delegation was sent down the mountain to the county magistrate. They returned with hollow eyes and a bitter truth. The law, the magistrate had sneered, did not extend to protecting the property or the people of mongrels and mountain witches. Their word against that of solid, God-fearing men like Silas Thorne? The notion was laughable. That was the night the old ways woke from their long slumber. Ilara gathered the remaining souls in the heart of a hidden cave, a place where the air was cold and the only light came from a single fire that cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. From a chest of buckled leather, she drew out a roll of tanned deerskin. Unfurled, it was blank. Then, she pricked her thumb with a flint blade and, in a script none of the younger ones had ever seen, began to write. The symbols were angular, alien, speaking of older shores and a colder justice. They have taken our peace. Ilara's voice was not loud, but it filled the cavern, resonating in the bones of those who heard it. They have taken our kin. The world below has offered its judgment. Now, we shall offer ours. She wrote 18 names. Silas Thorne's was the first, dark and stark at the top of the list. They believe these woods are dark and wild, she whispered, her eyes reflecting the hungry flames. They are about to learn the true meaning of both. We will hunt them. Not as men hunt deer, but as the frost hunts the autumn leaf. We will use the shadows they fear. We will speak with the voices of the wind and the creek. They will see our faces in their dreams before they see them in the trees. One by one, the men and women of Hollow Creek stepped forward, cut their own palms, and pressed them to the deerskin. The oath was not spoken aloud, it was sealed in blood and silence. The patient, waiting knowledge of the mountains had finally stirred, and it was coming for 18 men. The hunt for revenge had begun. The community of Hollow Creek did not so much inhabit the mountains as they were an extension of them, a quiet, weathered outcrop of humanity nestled in a fold of the ancient Appalachians. To the few outsiders who ever knew of its existence, it was a forgotten place, a collection of rough-hewn cabins and whispered about people. But to the Melungeons themselves, it was the entire world, a sanctuary carved from the very heart of the wilderness. Their peace was a tangible thing, woven from the rhythm of the seasons and the deep, abiding silence of the old-growth forests. They were a people apart, their origins a faded tapestry of rumor and suspicion, sailors from lost ships, explorers from vanished kingdoms, all blended with the first blood of the land. This mystery was worn not as a badge of shame, but as a private knowledge, a shared understanding that they were bound to the soil and stone in a way the men from the flatlands and valley towns could never comprehend. Their lives were a testament to quiet industry, to the patient cultivation of steep-sloped gardens and the respectful harvest from the boundless woods. Children learned the language of bird calls and the secret paths of the fox, while elders like Malachi could read the weather in the moss on the trees and the subtle shifts in the wind. There was a harmony here, a fragile, hard-won balance between a people and a landscape that offered bounty and brutality in equal measure. The mist that pooled in the hollows at dawn was their veil, the towering hemlocks their silent sentinels, and the relentless, patient turning of the seasons their only true clock. This isolation bred a profound and unshakable unity. A joy was shared by all, a grief shouldered by the entire community. It was an existence that asked for little from the outside world and offered even less, a closed circle of life that had persisted for generations in the deep, green heart of the mountains, a world so complete and self-contained that the notion of a threat from beyond its borders felt not just alarming, but almost sacrilegious, a violation of a natural order as fundamental as the sunrise. The arrival was not an event heralded by thunder or portent, but a slow, creeping stain, a dissonant rhythm, intruding upon the mountain's deep silence. It began with the uneasy shifting of livestock in their pens, a subtle tension that pricked at the instincts of the hunting dogs before their low growls echoed the first, far-off sounds. Then came the noise itself, the jarring, metallic clang of shod hooves on flinty rock, the coarse laughter that shredded the tranquil air, and the sharp, percussive crack of a whip, a sound wholly alien to the soft speech of the hollow. They emerged from the tree line not as travelers, but as a conquering force of six, their postures etched with the arrogance of men who believed the world was a thing to be bent to their will. They were men from Stonebrook, from the world of sawmills and deeds and a different, harsher god. Their clothes, though travel-stained, were of machine-spun cloth, and their faces, shaved and sharp, held the cold, assessing gaze of merchants at a market. They were led by Silas Thorne, a man who sat his saddle not as a rider part of his horse, but as a master upon a moving throne. His smile was a calculated tool, a thin, lipless gesture that never touched his eyes, which were the color of a winter sky just before a killing frost. He was the first to speak, his voice a measured, reasonable baritone that somehow made the threats within his words all the more chilling. He spoke of progress, of the great timber hunger of the nation, of the fortune in hardwood that stood untouched on these slopes, a sin against commerce and ambition. His men, a collection of hard-faced individuals with rifles cradled in their arms like infants, did not speak. Their eyes did the talking, roaming over the Melungeon women who watched from the shadows of cabin doorways with a possessive, hungry avarice, and scanning the sturdy, simple construction of the homes with the cold calculation of appraisers. They did not ask for water or directions, they stated their business as a foregone conclusion, their presence an ultimatum. The very air around them seemed to curdle, the gentle mountain breeze recoiling from the scent of their tobacco, their sweat, and the unvarnished ambition they carried like a banner. In that moment, the insulated world of Hollow Creek fractured, the ancient, unspoken compact of solitude shattered by the simple, brutal presence of men who saw not a home, but a resource to be claimed. The fragile tension that had held the hollow in its grip did not snap with a dramatic confrontation, but rotted from within, festering in the sly glances and muttered slurs of Thorne's men during their subsequent, uninvited visits. The initial veneer of civility, thin as river ice in early spring, gave way to a raw and open contempt. The Melungeons' quiet refusal to sell their land or their timber rights was not met with negotiation, but perceived as an insult, a defiance from a people they considered less than human. The breaking point was a small, almost trivial thing, a spark on a bed of dry tinder. A young Melungeon woman named Lisa, whose laughter had once been a familiar music in the creek bottom, was drawing water from the well when one of Thorne's men, a hulking figure named Daggett, approached her. His words were low and coarse, his intentions as clear as the hand he laid upon her arm. Her brother, Elias, a boy of 16 with his father's steady eyes, stepped from the cabin and spoke a single, firm word of warning. It was not a challenge, merely a boundary stated. But for Daggett, and for the watching Silas Thorne, it was an unpardonable act of rebellion. Thorne's smile was a ghastly thing as he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. What followed was a burst of controlled, brutal violence. Elias was beaten not in a frenzy, but with a cold, methodical precision, his cries swallowed by the encircling trees. Old man Malachi, hearing the commotion, emerged from his cabin with a hunting rifle, not raised in threat, but held in the cautious, defensive posture of a man protecting his own. He never got to speak a word. A shot, flat and final, rang out from Thorn's own pistol. Malachi fell backward, a dark flower blooming on his chest, his body a still, silent testament to the new law of the hollow. In the stunned silence that followed, Thorn's men moved with a terrible purpose. They did not ransack or loot, their prize was human. As the rest of the community watched in paralyzed horror, Daggett and 2 others seized Lisa and 2 other girls who had been hiding in the root cellar, their struggles as futile as birds against a storm wind. They were dragged, kicking and pleading, toward the waiting horses. Before they rode out, Thorn himself took Malachi's rabbit fur cap, a personal, intimate object, and with a slow, deliberate motion, pinned it to the trunk of the old chestnut tree with his skinning knife, a grotesque marker claiming not just a life, but the very soul of the place. The journey down the mountain was a funeral procession in reverse, a grim march toward a justice they already feared was a phantom. 3 of the community's steadiest men, bearing the weight of their people's shattered hope, walked the paths that had always separated their world from the other, their clothes still smelling faintly of wood smoke and the metallic scent of dried blood. The town of Stonebrook, when they reached it, was a place of jarring noise and straight lines, of clapboard buildings and the constant, grinding shriek of the sawmill. They stood on the warped planks of the boardwalk outside the magistrate's office, feeling the stares of the townsfolk like physical blows, their otherness a cloak they could not remove. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coal oil and cheap tobacco. Magistrate Proudfoot, a man whose face seemed to have set in a permanent expression of weary disdain, listened to their halting account with his fingers steepled, his eyes never leaving their faces. He heard the names Silas Thorn, Jedediah Daggett, and a flicker of something knowing, something complicit, passed behind his gaze. He heard the description of Malachi's murder, the abduction of the girls, and he sighed, a long, weary exhalation that dismissed their entire reality. When they finished, the silence was heavier than any they had known in the mountains. Proudfoot leaned forward, his chair groaning in protest. "Malachi," he said, as if tasting a foul thing. "That's the old one who claimed to be a Portuguese, ain't it? Lived like an animal in the woods." He shifted his gaze to the men. "And you expect me to take the word of you Melungeons, against men of property and standing? Mr. Thorn is a respected businessman. He's bringing commerce to this valley. He tells a different story. Tells me your people became agitated, threatened his surveyors, that there was a tragic accident during the ensuing confusion, and that any absences among your womenfolk are likely their own choice, seeking a better life away from your primitive circumstances." He picked up a pen, dipping it in an inkwell with a finality that was more devastating than any shout. "The law exists for civilized men, to protect their property and their persons. It does not extend to settling squabbles amongst mongrels and mountain witches. Now, get back to your hovels. Consider this a warning against making further baseless and slanderous accusations." They were ushered out not by force, but by the sheer, immovable weight of his contempt, the door closing behind them with a soft, definitive click that echoed the closing of the world's last door of justice. The hollow, upon the men's return, was a place of suffocating silence, a grief so profound it had stolen even the sound of the wind through the pines. The community gathered not in the open, but within the largest of the cabins, the air thick with the scent of despair and the bitter dregs of helplessness. It was Alara who finally moved, her stillness breaking not with a sob, but with a slow, deliberate rise from her seat by the cold hearth. She did not speak words of comfort. The time for comfort was ash. Instead, she walked to the back of the cabin, to a section of the wall that appeared seamless, and with a pressure known only to her, a hidden latch gave way. From a cavity within, she withdrew a chest not of wood, but of a strange, dark leather, oiled and supple with age, its surface tooled with symbols that seemed to shift in the low light. She carried it outside, the community following her in a silent, grim procession, not to the graveyard, but deeper into the woods, to the mouth of the hidden cave where the earth itself seemed to breathe a colder air. Inside, by the light of a single torch she kindled with flint and tinder, she opened the chest. Within, resting on a cloth of faded indigo, lay a collection of objects that spoke of a past far older and stranger than any valley rumor. A tarnished silver medallion etched with a lost mariner's star, a handful of arrowheads chipped from a stone not native to any Appalachian quarry, and a slender, cruel-looking dagger with a blade that seemed to drink the light. But it was the rolled deerskin she carefully lifted that held their gaze. As her fingers, gnarled and strong, traced its blank surface, a change came over her. Her eyes, usually deep pools of quiet knowledge, grew distant, fixed on a memory not her own, a pain carried in the blood. Her voice, when it came, was not the familiar cadence of their elder, but lower, layered with echoes, as if many were speaking through her. She spoke of a time before the Hollow, of a people harried and persecuted across oceans and continents, who had learned that the justice of men was a fleeting, fickle thing. She spoke of a covenant made long ago, a promise to the old, hard gods of vengeance and the deep, dark earth, that when the world's law failed, as it always did, they would enact their own. This was not a new idea she proposed, it was a remembering. It was the awakening of a slumbering instinct, a primal, inherited capacity for a retribution that was not hot and wild, but cold, patient, and absolute, a lineage of wrath passed down through blood and bone and the long, bitter memory of the wronged. The torchlight did not illuminate the cavern so much as it fought a desperate, flickering war against a darkness that felt ancient and hungry. In that pulsating, uncertain light, Ilara's face was a mask of carved oak, her eyes reflecting not the flame, but the void behind it. The rolled deerskin lay at her feet, and from within the leather chest, she produced a small, rough-formed clay bowl and the flint dagger. She did not look at the gathered faces, pale and stricken around her. Her audience was the memory of the dead and the promise of the pain to come. With a ritualistic slowness, she drew the dagger's edge across her own palm. The blood that welled up was black in the eerie light. She let it drip into the bowl, the sound a slow, ticking clock marking the end of one age and the beginning of another. Her voice, when it rose again, was stripped of all humanity, becoming a channel for the cold, whispering will of the mountain itself. She spoke the words of the oath, not in English, nor in any tongue the younger members had ever heard, but in the guttural, forgotten language of their deepest ancestry, each syllable sounding like a stone falling into a deep well. She named the transgression, the murder, the theft of their future, the defilement of their sanctuary. She named the price, a life for a life, a reckoning for 18 souls. Then, one by one, they came forward. There were no speeches, no cries of rage. The grief had been cooked down into a residue of pure, cold purpose. Elias, his face still swollen and bruised from the beating, was the first. He took the dagger, its handle cold despite the proximity of the flame, and sliced his own palm without a flinch, his blood joining Ilara's in the bowl. His mother, Reva, followed, her tears dry, her cut deep and sure. A hunter named Caleb, a man known for his gentle way with animals, carved his flesh with the same practiced efficiency he used to field dress a deer. Young women whose sisters had been taken, old men who had felled trees with Malachi, they all stepped forward, a silent, solemn line. Each cut, each drop of blood, was a signature. When the last had given their offering, Ilara dipped her fingers into the bowl, now holding the collective life of the community, and pressed them to the deerskin. Where her fingers touched, the strange, angular script began to appear, searing itself into the hide as if burned by an invisible fire. One by one, she wrote the 18 names, each one a death sentence written not in ink, but in the shed blood of the wronged. The oath was now a physical thing, a covenant that hung in the air, thick and metallic. They were no longer merely victims pleading for justice, they had become the instrument of a darker, older law. The first name on the list, beneath the still smouldering rune of Silas Thorne, was that of Harlan Skeet, a lean, rat-faced man known for his cruelty with animals and his quickness to laugh at the pain of others. He had been one of the loudest, one of the most eager during the violence at the Hollow. The hunt for him was not a blind chase, but a patient, deliberate unfolding. Elias and Caleb, moving with a silence that seemed to be a gift from the awakened darkness itself, tracked him not as men, but as extensions of the shadowed woods. They knew the old logging trails he would use, the hidden still he would visit to boast of his exploits and wet his throat. They did not confront him on the path. Instead, they let him pass, a boisterous, drunken silhouette against the moonlit trees, his voice slurring songs of vulgar triumph. They waited until he bedded down in a hunter's lean-to, his fire a tiny, arrogant challenge to the vast night. They did not attack with weapons of steel. They began with sound, a low, ululating cry that was neither wolf nor owl, a sound that coiled from the gullies and seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then, a single, large stone, dropped from the branches above, landing with a dead thud just outside the ring of firelight. When Harlan, his nerves frayed by whiskey and the unsettling noises, stumbled out with his rifle held high, they were upon him not with a roar, but with a whisper. They used the terrain, the very roots and shadows, to trip and disorient him. His terror was a palpable thing, a sour stink on the air as he realized he was not fighting men, but the forest itself. His end was swift, but his body was left not as a mere corpse, but as a message. They arranged him in a posture of grotesque pleading at the base of a lightning-blasted oak, and on his forehead, they smeared a mixture of ash and clay in the same angular symbol that had marked his name on the deerskin. He was found 2 days later by a trapper, whose description of the scene, of the unearthly stillness, the untouched supplies, and the strange, terrifying mark spread through the valley settlements not as a story of murder, but as an encounter with something ancient and deeply wrong. The death of Harlan Skeet was not just a killing, it was the first note in a grim symphony, a declaration that the rules of this conflict had been irrevocably rewritten by a power the men of Stonebrook could not name and therefore could not fight. The disappearance of Harlan Skeet was initially dismissed in the taverns of Stonebrook as the predictable end for a shiftless and unlikable man, a drunken fall into a ravine, an encounter with a bear. But when Jedediah Daggett, the hulking brute who had laid hands on Lisa, failed to return from checking his trap lines, a different, colder understanding began to dawn. Daggett was a man of substantial strength and violent reputation, not one to be easily bested by man or beast. A search party found his line shack empty, the door swinging open on its leather hinges. Inside, everything was in perfect order, his bedroll neat, a half-eaten plate of beans on the table gone cold. It was the absence of a struggle that was the most chilling detail. It was as if he had simply been plucked from existence. Outside, however, they found the tracks. Not the clear, purposeful prints of a man hunting another, but a chaotic, overlapping scuffle that told a story of pure, disorienting terror. The tracks led in a frantic circle around the shack before plunging into the thick undergrowth, where the searchers found a single, deep gouge in the soft earth, as if a body had been dragged with immense force. And there, carved into the bark of a young beech tree at the edge of the clearing, was that same strange, angular mark. The story of the trapper's discovery of Skeet now resurfaced, no longer a tall tale but a grim corroboration. The mood in Stonebrook shifted from casual contempt to a creeping, superstitious dread. The men who had ridden with Thorn, once boastful and swaggering, now looked over their shoulders at the slightest sound. The familiar woods that bordered their town, a source of timber and game, became a wall of impenetrable, watchful menace. Every creak of a branch in the night was a footstep, every hoot of an owl a signal. They began to lock their doors, a practice once considered unnecessary in a community of solid, God-fearing men. Whispers of mountain witches and the old blood circulated, no longer as a slur, but as a terrified acknowledgement of a power they had profoundly underestimated. Their arrogance, once as solid as the mountains themselves, crumbled into the sickly clay of paranoia. They had come to the hollow as masters of their destiny, armed with deeds and rifles and the certainty of their superiority. Now, they were cornered animals in their own homes, starting at shadows, realizing with a cold, gut-wrenching certainty that they were not the hunters, but the hunted, and that the things coming for them from the high places were not men who fought by any rules they knew. The vengeance of the Melungeons became a thing not merely of flesh and blood, but of the mind itself, a spectral campaign waged in the liminal space between waking and nightmare. They understood that a clean, quick death in the woods could be explained away, rationalized by their enemies as a hunting accident or a stroke of bad luck. To truly break the will of the men from Stonebrook, they had to attack the very fabric of their sanity, to make the world around them feel alive with a hostile, intelligent malice. The hunters from the hollow became phantoms, using their intimate knowledge of the land to move like mist, to speak with stolen voices. For Jonas Pettibone, a man who had laughed as Malachi fell, the assault began with sounds. As he tried to sleep in his locked cabin, he would hear the distinct, light laughter of one of the abducted girls, seeming to come from just outside his window, a sound that would cut off the moment he pressed his eye to the glass. For another, It was the smell, the specific, homely scent of the pine sap soap used in Hollow Creek would flood his barn in the dead of night, thick and cloying, vanishing by dawn. They used the outsider's own superstitions against them, leaving small, unsettling tokens where they would be found: a dead crow with its wings arranged in a precise angle on a chopping block, a child's doll made of corn husks propped against a water trough, its face smudged with dark clay. The most potent weapon was the sight of them, the Melungeons themselves. They would allow themselves to be seen, but never clearly, never for more than a heartbeat. A tall, shadowy figure standing motionless in the tree line at twilight, its gaze felt more than seen. A pale face, glimpsed for a fraction of a second in the dark glass of a window, reflecting a world inside the house that should have been empty. These were not the furtive movements of skulking enemies, but the deliberate, haunting appearances of something that wanted to be seen, that was announcing its presence as a predator announces its dominion over a territory. The men began to jump at the settling of their own houses, their hands trembling so badly they could scarcely hold a whiskey glass. They saw the angular, runic symbol etched in the frost on their windows in the morning, or found it scraped into the mud near their front steps. Sleep became a forgotten luxury, replaced by a staring, wide-eyed fear that eroded their reason and turned them into husks, jumping at their own shadows, seeing the vengeance of the hollow in every rustle of leaves and sigh of the wind. The hunt had narrowed, its focus sharpened to a single, burning point. Of the 18 names, 17 had been crossed off the deerskin, their fates a grim tapestry of terror and retribution that had left the valley shrouded in a silence of pure dread. Silas Thorne was the last. He had barricaded himself not in the heart of Stonebrook, where the presence of others might have offered a fleeting sense of security, but in the very symbol of his avarice, a half-built logging camp at the edge of the disputed territory, a place of raw stumps and the skeletal frames of bunkhouses. He sat alone in the foreman's shack, a lamp burning low, a loaded rifle across his knees, and a pistol on the table. The arrogant man of commerce was gone, replaced by a twitching, wild-eyed creature, his fine clothes stained with sweat and his mind picked clean by the crows of fear. He heard them long before he saw them. It began not as a sound, but as a change in the pressure of the night air, a deepening of the silence that somehow became a presence. Then came the soft, almost rhythmic tapping on the walls of the shack, not a frantic beating, but a patient, probing sound, as if the trees themselves were knocking, asking to be let in. A low, chanted whisper in that forgotten tongue filtered through the cracks in the logs, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from every direction at once, speaking words that coiled into his brain like cold smoke. He fired his rifle blindly through the wall, the report shockingly loud and useless in the vast, swallowing dark. The only answer was a soft, mocking echo of his own gunshot from the hills. Then the door, which he had barred with a heavy timber, began to open. It did not splinter or burst. Instead, the iron bracket holding the bar simply came loose from the wood with a sound of groaning, protesting nails, as if the very building had decided to betray him. Framed in the doorway was Ilara. She stood alone, her silver hair seeming to glow with its own light, her face a placid mask of terrible finality. In her hands, she held not a weapon, but the deerskin, now fully marked with the dark, bloody script of the 18 names. Behind her, in the darkness between the trees, pairs of eyes caught the faint lamplight, reflecting it back at him a semicircle of silent, watching figures. Thorne raised his pistol, his hand shaking so violently the barrel danced in the air. He pulled the trigger. The hammer fell on a damp charge with a hollow, pathetic click. Ilara took a single step forward, her gaze holding his, and in that moment, he understood everything. He was not being executed by men. He was being reclaimed by the mountain. He was the final payment on a debt older than deeds, a sacrifice to a justice that had been sleeping in the blood of the people he had wronged, and was now awake. The last thing Silas Thorne saw was the deerskin, unfurling towards him like a wing of darkness, as the shadows in the room behind Ilara began to move.